Throughout the entire week, markets were sort of a little nervous about China. And then at the very end of the week, President Trump had a big news conference at the White House. And he said, boy, there are bad things coming for China. He did withdraw from the WHO, so there's going to be sanctions. But the markets kind of shrugged it off. Is this real or is it saber rattling?
Some of both. Our withdrawal from the WHO is probably not as consequential as when the United States decided not to join the League of Nations after the First World War, but it may be the most important withdrawal from internationalism that the United States has engaged in since the Second World War. It's a completely irresponsible act that will set back the effort to combat disease in the world and will ultimately hurt our security. God knows the WHO is deeply flawed, but the United States should be fixing it, not abandoning it. And future generations will regret this decision and the lack of trust that comes from it. It's not something that affects the profits of companies over the next several years, so it doesn't affect the stock market. But that's the really consequential thing that happened today. The sparring on Hong Kong doesn't involve something that is going to concretely hurt corporate profits. That's why the market didn't react. And the market's been pricing in the fact that the United States and China are at deep loggerheads in a way they haven't been since Nixon opened to China 50 years ago. And that's what's continuing to play out and played out today. But I think that the fact that there's no market response shouldn't make people complacent, not about the United States abandoning the World Health Organization and not about the state of the U.S. China relationship, which I believe if history goes wrong, goes off track in this decade, the far and away the most likely way in which that will happen is fissures between the United States and China.
So, Larry, if the goal is to modify China's behavior in some way, shape, or form, is there a way to do that as a practical matter? It looks like President Xi's decided what he wants to do, whether it's in Hong Kong and other places. It doesn't look like anything we're doing is changing his mind any.
Look, I think one of the lessons of human life, and it's also a lesson of global life, is that it's harder to change people and it's harder to change nations than we often hope it would be. And that threats and scolding are not all that effective as tactics. And so I'm not surprised that this isn't working very well with respect to China. And of course, it creates all the wrong incentives over the medium and long term. It strengthens the people who say in China that any kind of interrelationship with the United States is a mistake, against those who want to be more intertwined with the United States. It teaches China that they need to avoid any kind of vulnerability to us, which means they will put more emphasis on splintering their technologies and their economic approach from anything that's global and is involved with us. But in fairness, these are really hard problems, and it's much easier to object to particular means that are being pursued than it is to propose ways that will be effective. I think over time, we're going to have to reduce our aspirations for how much we're going to change China and concentrate on the set of issues that most directly impact on our security. And we're going to have to think about aspects of our own behavior that at times are provocative, and recognize that in a bargain, you have to demand, you get to demand things, but you also have to respond to the other side's concerns, and that our concept can't be that we run the world and China gets to decide how exactly it wants to fit into the world we run. That's probably not going to work given China's current strength and broad economic power. The one other thing
Larry,
I would
you've
say,
consistently expressed.
I'd say one other thing, if I could, David. I think probably the single most serious foreign policy error that the Trump administration has made is the more you think that China is in various ways a serious threat, the more important it is that we have strong global alliances with all the other countries in the world. And so what is odd is a strategy of elevating the China threat and at the same time not aggressively trying to get close to all the other countries, and instead, in many ways, abrogating commitments to them and lashing out at them in various ways. In a world where we want to put trade sanctions on China, what could be dumber than threatening trade sanctions on Canada and Europe and all the other countries who we need to cooperate with us if we're to have a realistic chance of influencing China's behavior?
Larry, I want to come back to the United States just for a couple of minutes here, because you've expressed concern about how quickly we're coming back, at least in some parts of the country, whether we're ready, whether we have the testing, the contact tracing, things like that. We are starting to open back up. Even here in New York now, we're hearing New York City may be opening within the next couple of weeks. How will it be different? These cities now, these big cities, there's a lot of talk now about whether these cities like New York City, like Boston, other places, whether they'll ever be the same again.
Look, I think they're two separate questions there, David. Several weeks ago, a set of criteria were laid out. There seemed to be a consensus around those criteria. In fact, the Trump administration laid them out for how much progress we had to make with respect to health, how much death counts had to come down, how much testing had to be in place. None of those criteria have been met, and we're still moving ahead. And I think those were probably reasonable criteria when we laid them out, and I think it's therefore quite risky to be moving ahead. I can understand why the decision is being made, but I'm very concerned, and I think we are taking substantial risks of a second wave of a reemergence. Everything the world knows about pandemic disease suggests that it doesn't grow. It's not an inverted V. It doesn't grow and then revert back to zero. It's more like upside down W. It goes up and then it comes down and then it goes up again. And I think we're taking a substantial risk of that. And people, markets need to be aware that that's very much a risk we're taking. We could be doing much more to minimize that risk. We could have a much more organized national effort to massively increase the level of testing in the United States, for example, but we don't. We could be engaged in a major effort when there are tens of millions of people who are unemployed to hire people to do contact tracing so as to reduce the spread. We could recognize, as is increasingly being recognized by the scientists, the problem of super spreaders, and be trying to pursue targeted strategies directed at making sure that any super spreaders are separated from the rest of the population as rapidly as possible. But we're not doing any of that. And so I think we are taking substantial, needless risks of more trouble down the road. We may luck out. It may be okay. Nobody can predict pandemics, but sometimes people don't buy insurance and they don't get sick. And it works out okay not to have bought insurance, but that doesn't make it the right thing to do. So I'm alarmed at our strategy. I think it's extremely odd that as a country, we are debating, and this is a bipartisan issue, we are debating a $3 trillion bill, and not 2% of it is devoted to finding vaccines and therapies and increasing testing. And so I would suggest as a minimum threshold of responsibility that 2% of any legislation we devote to addressing these economic problems be devoted to the health aspect.